The rain was a cold, insistent curtain, making the streetlights smear across the wet asphalt. Detective Tommy Rourke sighed, the sound barely audible over the crackle of the police radio. It was 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday, the dead hour in the deadest part of the district. 8 years on the force hadn't dulled his dislike for the graveyard shift, but it had certainly thickened his skin. His partner, Officer Lena Mendez, a sharp young woman with eyes that missed nothing, was scrolling through a neighborhood watch feed on her phone. "Slow night, huh, Tommy? Think we'll even catch a jaywalker." "Don't jinx it, kid," Rourke grumbled, rubbing the ache in his temple. "Quiet is good. Quiet means less paperwork." Just then, the radio spat static, followed by the dispatcher's clipped, bored voice. "All units in Sector 4, report of a disturbance at 412 Blackwood Lane. Unidentified caller reports screaming, possibly a break-in. Proceed with caution." Rourke and Mendez exchanged a look. Blackwood Lane. Even the name sounded wrong. It was the kind of street lined with massive, century-old houses, set back from the road behind walls of overgrown ivy and shadows. The kind of place where things went unseen and unheard. "For 12 Blackwood," Rourke said, pulling the cruiser away from the curb. "That's the old Albright place, right? Been vacant for years. Or at least, it should be." "The Unblinking House," Mendez murmured, lowering her phone. "The local kids have a story about it. Says the windows on the 3rd floor look like eyes watching the street, and if you look back long enough, something looks back at you. Save the ghost stories for Halloween, Mendez. It's a structure fire or some kids pulling a prank," Rourke said, though a familiar knot of unease tightened in his gut. When they arrived, the house was everything the legend implied. It was huge, dark, and utterly silent. The rain was easing, and a sickly sliver of moon peeked through the clouds, illuminating the peeling white paint and the oppressive, vine-choked porch. Rourke killed the engine. The sudden silence was heavier than the engine noise had been. "I don't hear screaming," Mendez whispered, her hand hovering near her sidearm. "Me neither. Stay sharp. Prank or not, we gotta check it out." They approached the front door, flashlights cutting white cones through the gloom. The front door was a heavy, dark oak, but it wasn't locked. In fact, it was slightly ajar. "That's not good," Rourke muttered. He pushed the door open, the sound of the hinges groaning echoing through the massive, empty foyer. The air inside was stale, thick with the smell of dust, old wood, and something metallic, like burnt pennies. Rourke's beam swept over the cavernous space. Grand staircase, dusty antique furniture draped in white sheets, a single, deep crimson stain on the polished hardwood floor near the bottom step. Mendez choked back a gasp. "Tommy, look." Her light was focused not on the stain, but on the staircase banister. It was covered in thin, almost deliberate scratches, arranged in an irregular pattern that looked disturbingly like a child's crude, repeated drawing of a stick figure, or perhaps a warning. Rourke gripped his flashlight tighter. "Okay, this isn't a prank. Mendez, stay down here, keep an eye on the door. I'm taking the stairs." "No, sir. By the book, we stick together." He conceded with a nod. They ascended the grand staircase slowly, their footsteps muffled by the dust. As they reached the first landing, Rourke's light caught a picture frame lying face down on a small side table. He flipped it over. It was a faded photograph of a smiling family. The Albrights, perhaps. The parents stiffly posed, a little girl with bright, dark eyes holding a rag doll. The girl's eyes, even in the faded photo, seemed to bore into him. As he turned to continue up to the 2nd floor, a sound stopped him dead. It wasn't a scream or a crash. It was a low, rhythmic thump-thump-thump coming from the 2nd floor hallway, the sound of something heavy dragging itself across the floor, or maybe the sound of a rag doll being dropped, picked up, and dropped again. Mendez drew her weapon, the click of the safety sounding impossibly loud. "What is that?" Rourke held up a hand, his heart hammering against his ribs. He took a single, slow step toward the hallway where the sound was emanating. The hallway was pitch black. The thump-thump-thump stopped, and then, from the blackness, came a voice. It was a dry, thin sound, like dead leaves skittering across concrete, yet it was distinctly a whisper. You came home. The floorboards in the hallway groaned, right in front of where Rourke was aiming his light. The beam trembled in his hand. Police. Show yourself, Rourke yelled, his voice sounding hollow and forced in the immense silence. He expected a suspect, maybe a vagrant, a lunatic. He expected a person. He did not expect the slow, deliberate appearance of a pair of large, dark, unblinking eyes, hovering 6 feet off the ground in the complete darkness, eyes that reflected the beam of his flashlight with an unnatural, wet gleam. They were not human, and they were not alone. In the brief moment before the sound of rushing movement overwhelmed the silence, Rourke felt a cold understanding settle over him. This wasn't a crime scene. This was a trap. The moment the unblinking eyes appeared, the silence shattered. Rourke didn't hesitate. Pure instinct, honed by years on the street, took over. Mendez down. Go. He shoved his partner backward just as a blur of motion launched itself from the end of the hallway. Rourke fired his service pistol twice. The deafening cracks echoed, followed by the splintering sound of wood where the round struck the wall beyond the target. Whatever it wasn't deterred. It moved with a speed and an unnatural, low-to-the-ground gait that defied anatomy. Rourke only saw a fleeting image, something long, thin, and dark, disappearing around the corner, heading toward the back stairs. Mendez was already up, heart pounding, flashlight beam frantically sweeping the spot where the eyes had been. Did you hit it, Tommy? What the hell was that? I don't know, Rourke rasped, his breath clouding in the cold air of the house. He quickly checked his surroundings. Too fast. It felt like nothing solid, like a shadow with mass. He reholstered his weapon, his hand still shaking slightly. We need to get out and call in the tactical team. This is not a break-in. Wait, Mendez said, pointing her light to the floor. Look, in the dusty patch where the figure had stood, there were no footprints, no blood, just a scattering of fine, gray-white powder, like dried mortar or bone dust. And near the baseboard, a single, black feather, impossibly long and stiff. It went up, Rourke said, looking towards the dimly visible back staircase that led to the 3rd floor. The Unblinking House. The 3rd floor windows. That's where the caller said the screaming came from, Mendez reminded him, her voice tight. We need to secure the perimeter, Tommy. We don't chase things that move that fast and don't bleed. We can't just leave an open crime scene where shots were fired, Rourke countered, though he knew her training was sound. His eyes were fixed on the back stairs, which were narrower, steeper, and looked like they hadn't been used in decades. And if there's a victim up there, we're too close to back away now, Mendez. One quick sweep of the 3rd floor. If we find anything, we retreat immediately and call it in. If we find nothing, we call it in as a clear and exit. Mendez nodded reluctantly, her jaw set. Fine, but you lead. And we move slow. The back staircase felt colder, the air heavier. With every step, the old would groan under their weight, each sound magnified. On the landing to the 3rd floor, the change was immediate and sickening. The metallic smell was overpowering now, mixed with a sharp, cloying sweetness, like rotting fruit. The hallway was much shorter than the floors below, lit by 3 arched windows overlooking the front yard, the unblinking eyes from the legend. Moonlight poured through them, but instead of illuminating the space, it seemed to cling to the edges, creating deeper, more oppressive shadows. The floor was slick. Rourke directed his flashlight down. The slickness was a coating of dark, viscous liquid, a trail of it leading from the top of the stairs straight toward the last room at the end of the hall. Blood, Mendez whispered, gagging. Fresh blood. Rourke's adrenaline spiked, pushing back the fear. Clear the rooms on the left. I'll take the right. Keep your gun ready. If that thing is still up here, it's wounded, cornered, and dangerous. They moved methodically. The rooms were small, empty, and cold. In the 3rd room on the right, Rourke found the source of the persistent, sickly sweet smell. It was a small table covered in a layer of dried, crumbling objects. Dozens of desiccated roses, their petals gray and brittle, arranged around an antique silver locket that was inexplicably tarnished and black. Nothing here but morbid decor, Rourke muttered into his radio, which was only transmitting static. Damn it, Mendez, we're losing signal up here. I found the source of the screaming, Tommy. Mendez's voice came back, strained and low, from the end of the hall. You need to see this. Rourke rushed toward the last door. It was slightly ajar. He pushed it open, his light beam cutting into the room. It was an attic room, filled with the usual clutter of storage, trunks, broken lamps, and shadows. But the center of the room was dominated by an astonishing, sickening spectacle. A massive, circular arrangement of objects was laid out on the dusty floor. It wasn't the blood trail that drew the eye. That was merely a perimeter. In the center of the circle, countless small, human teeth were scattered like rice, interspersed with tiny, curled bones, perhaps from a bird or a small mammal. And hanging from a thick, exposed wooden rafter directly above the circle, suspended by ropes of braided human hair, was the ragdoll from the photograph on the first floor. Its button eyes seemed to stare down at the floor, and its threadbare fabric was stained dark red. But it was what was happening to the wall directly opposite them that froze the two officers. The wall was covered in hundreds of the same scratch marks Rourke had seen on the banister, childlike stick figures, repeated over and over, all facing the center of the circle. As Rourke watched, a fresh mark was drawn, not with a pencil or a knife, but with a smear of the same dark, viscous liquid that was on the floor. And then, a sound. A quiet, soft hiss came from the shadows behind a stack of old mattresses. Rourke raised his weapon, adrenaline screaming in his ears. "Police, don't move," a voice replied, but it was not the dry, whispering horror from the second floor. This was a young, terrified voice, shaking with tears. Please, don't let it see me." The voice belonged to a girl, the victim. Rourke took a step forward, his gun aimed at the shadows. "We're police. We're getting you out of here. Where are you?" From the shadows, a small, dark figure crawled out from behind the mattresses. It was a girl, maybe 10 years old, dressed in a faded nightgown. Her arms and legs were covered in painful-looking scrapes, and her face was streaked with tears and grime. She looked up at them, her eyes wide with palpable terror. It made me draw," she sobbed. "It says I have to stay here until the moon is full, and it's coming back for the last piece." Rourke and Mendez exchanged a relieved, if strained, look. A victim. Real. This was bad, but it was a crime they understood. "Okay, sweetheart. We're taking you home," Rourke said gently, taking a step toward her. But just as he did, the girl's expression shifted. The panic drained away, replaced by a sudden, vacant stillness. Her head tilted to the side at an impossible angle, and a small, unsettling smile stretched across her face. The smile grew, unnatural and too wide. And the girl's voice, which moments ago had been a child's sob, deepened and cracked, taking on the same dry, leaf-skittering quality Rourke had heard on the floor below. "It's already here, officer. And the last piece is your eyes." The girl's arms shot out, no longer those of a child, but long, thin, and tipped with needle-like claws that scraped the dusty floor as she lunged at Rourke. The girl's transformation was instant and grotesque. The smile stretched so wide it seemed to tear the skin at her cheeks, revealing teeth that were suddenly too long and too sharp. The arms that lunged toward Rourke were thin, almost skeletal, yet moved with terrifying, inhuman power. Rourke roared, stumbling back. He didn't fire. He couldn't. It was still a child's body, twisted and controlled by something else, but still a child. "Mendez, taser," he yelled. Mendez, frozen for a heartbeat by the sickening sight, snapped back into action. She dropped her firearm, yanked her taser, and fired. The twin darts hit the girl's chest with a sharp thwack-thwack. 700,000 volts of electricity ripped through the possessed body. The girl shrieked, a high, unnatural sound that hurt the ears, and collapsed in a sparking, twitching heap, the needle-like claws scraping uselessly on the floor. Did we kill her?" Mendez whispered, her face pale in the light. "No, just delayed it," Rourke said, his chest heaving. He rushed to the girl, grabbing her by the arms, which were now slack and child-sized again. and began dragging her toward the door. "We need to get her out of this room now." As they pulled the inert body of the girl across the threshold, the circular arrangement on the floor of the attic room began to react. The countless tiny teeth rattled against the wood. The black feather Rourke had seen on the second floor seemed to materialize within the circle of blood and teeth, vibrating rapidly. The sound that followed wasn't a growl or a shriek. It was a rapid, sucking, inhaling noise, like a vacuum cleaner running at full power, coming from the ritual circle. The dried roses, the bones, the feather, even the dust on the floor, flew toward the circle's center, disappearing instantly. The red stain of blood on the floor seemed to drain inward, pulling the viscous liquid toward the ragdoll hanging above, which began to twitch slowly on its human hair ropes. "The room is eating the evidence," Mendez yelled. "It's consuming the ritual." "Forget the ritual. We get the victim," Rourke countered, pulling the girl faster. They burst out of the attic room and stumbled down the narrow back staircase, the child's body heavy and limp between them. The moment their feet hit the second-floor landing, the air was suddenly still. The sucking sound was gone. "The front door? Cruiser, go," Rourke ordered. They moved at a frantic, uneven pace through the second-floor hallway, past the point where the creature had first appeared. They reached the main staircase and began their descent to the ground floor. Halfway down, a flicker of movement caught Rourke's eye. Up above, at the top of the grand staircase, at the edge of the shadows where the light did not reach, something was standing. It was impossibly tall, unnaturally thin, and shrouded in darkness so complete it seemed to absorb the light. It was merely an outline, but Rourke could feel the weight of its gaze. It was staring at them. Specifically, it was staring at the girl they were carrying. Rourke and Mendez froze, caught in the middle of the staircase. The silence of the house returned, thick and cold. Then, the entity moved. It didn't walk. It seemed to flow down the stairs, its long, shadowy limbs extending and contracting with disturbing fluidity. As it descended, a faint, dry whisper echoed. "My new eyes." Rourke knew they couldn't outrun it while carrying the girl. He made a split-second decision. "Mendez, take her. Keep going. Don't look back." He pushed the girl into Mendez's arms and drew his weapon, turning back toward the oncoming shadow, planting his feet firmly on the middle step. He was a detective, not a priest, but he knew he was facing something ancient and utterly malevolent. "Stop! Police!" Rourke's voice was steadier than he felt. The creature ignored him. It flowed past the stain on the main floor, its shape momentarily contorting as if feeding on the dark memory of the spot. It began to climb the steps toward him. As it got closer, Rourke could finally see some detail through the gloom. It wasn't just tall, its proportions were fundamentally wrong. Its head was a smooth, dark sphere, and its body was comprised of layers of thin, papery black material that seemed to ripple like cloth in a non-existent breeze. And where its face should have been, Rourke saw only two pits of absolute blackness, voids that seemed to pull the light toward them. Rourke fired 3 rapid shots, aimed at the center mass. The bullets hit the creature with a dull, papery thud-thud-thud. The entity staggered back a step, its structure momentarily distorted, but there was no blood, no injury. It was like shooting thick air. It paused, then let out a low, guttural chittering noise, a sound of contempt, perhaps, before lunging the remaining distance at Rourke. Rourke sidestepped the attack, the creature's massive, shadowy form scraping past him, the air around it suddenly dropping in temperature, leaving behind a faint smell of ozone and burnt pennies. It hadn't been aiming for him. It was aiming for the girl. The creature landed on the stairs just below Rourke and immediately turned back, blocking the way down for Mendez and the girl. Rourke was now trapped between the creature and the upper floors. Mendez screamed from the foyer. "Tommy, run!" The creature raised one of its long, thin arms, not to attack Mendez, but to gesture toward the front door. The lock on the oak door, which had been ajar, suddenly slammed shut with a reverberating crack. They were locked in. The creature turned its void-like gaze back toward Rourke, the sheer malevolence of its focus making his skin crawl. The dry whisper returned. this time echoing directly in Rourke's mind. "The little one is mine. And you, detective, you will watch." Rourke didn't panic. Panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. He leveled his pistol at the creature blocking the staircase. "Mendez, get the crowbar from the cruiser. Now," he yelled, hoping the desperate order would push her into action, even though the front door was locked. He needed a diversion, anything to buy time. The creature's attention remained fixed on Rourke, its shadowy mass seeming to grow denser. "Your attempts are pitiful. The sacrifice must be whole." Rourke fired the remaining 4 rounds in his clip, aiming for the creature's center mass. Click, 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 click. The entity absorbed the bullets with the same dismissive thuds, seemingly unfazed. It simply flowed forward, pushing Rourke further up the stairs. Rourke backed up rapidly, retreating to the second-floor landing. He spun around, sprinting for the back staircase, the one they had used to ascend. "Mendez, retreat to the back. There's a door in the kitchen. Try that." He risked a glance back. The creature was not pursuing him with the frantic speed of a hunter. It was moving with the slow, inevitable pace of a predator cornering its prey. It wanted Rourke to be afraid. He reached the back stairs and plunged down, 2 steps at a time. The metallic smell was still heavy here, and the silence had been replaced by a low, humming vibration that seemed to emanate from the very structure of the house. He burst into the ground-floor kitchen, a room of peeling paint and rusted appliances. Mendez was at the front door, desperately shouldering the heavy oak, which remained sealed. The girl lay unconscious on the floor nearby. "The back door. Now!" Rourke screamed. Mendez abandoned the front door and scrambled toward the rear of the kitchen. They located the door leading to the backyard, a heavy wooden service door, and Mendez immediately began working the deadbolt. It was old, corroded, and refused to budge. "It's rusted shut, Tommy. I can't turn the key." Rourke glanced back at the kitchen entrance. The shadowy form of the creature was already entering the room, its presence sucking the light and warmth from the air. "Break it!" Rourke roared, grabbing a rusted frying pan from the counter. He slammed the pan against the creature's head. The object crumpled into a twisted piece of scrap metal, and the entity barely reacted, its outline momentarily flickering like a failing light. The creature's whisper filled the kitchen, a chorus of voices speaking in unison inside Rourke's mind. "The key is not for the lock, detective. The key is for the cage." Mendez, tears streaming down her face from the sheer panic and desperation, grabbed a heavy, antique meat cleaver hanging on the wall and began hacking wildly at the deadbolt. Thwack! Thwack! Rourke grabbed a chair and threw it at the creature, buying precious seconds. "The basement!" Rourke yelled, spotting a small, dark door near the kitchen pantry. "It's the only other exit. Go!" Mendez didn't hesitate. She abandoned the back door and shouldered the basement door. It swung open onto a set of rough, wooden steps descending into absolute blackness. She grabbed the girl's body and scrambled down. Rourke backed into the doorway, firing his single remaining bullet, a useless gesture that only annoyed the entity. He tossed the empty gun onto the floor and slipped backward into the basement, slamming the door shut with a heavy boot. He fumbled for the thick iron latch, throwing the bolt home just as the creature's mass slammed against the other side. The door shuddered violently. Splinters flew from the old wood. "We need light," Rourke gasped, fumbling with his flashlight, which had nearly died. Mendez already had hers on. It revealed a low-ceilinged, dirt-floor basement, smelling of damp earth and decay. It was packed with debris, old coal bins, and a few massive, concrete pillars supporting the house. "It won't hold," Mendez cried, pointing to the door, which was bowing inward. Rourke spotted a heavy, cast-iron furnace pipe leaning against the wall. He rushed to it, heaving the massive pipe, and jammed it crosswise beneath the doorknob. Wham! The creature hit the door again, causing the pipe to vibrate painfully against the door frame, but the pipe held. "Okay, basement," Rourke panted, wiping sweat and grime from his brow. "There has to be another way out." He shone his light around. The basement was a tangle of ancient pipes, wiring, and shadows. Mendez was tending to the girl, checking for a pulse. She's alive. Barely, Mendez reported. Her eyes, they're open, but they're rolled back. She's in shock, or something worse. The creature began scraping at the door, a terrible sound of wood being torn away by something with immense strength. Rourke swept his light across the far wall, where the foundation met the earth. He saw nothing but concrete and dirt, no windows, no coal chute. But as he swung his light back, he caught something that hadn't registered before. A single, small, hand-painted wooden sign tacked to one of the large concrete pillars. 412. The address. Below it, in faded, spidery handwriting, was a line of text. The consumption begins where the cycle ends. The basement watches all. And right next to the sign, half hidden by a mound of coal dust, was a rusted iron ring set into the concrete floor. A trapdoor. Mendez, help me, Rourke shouted, grabbing the ring. They both pulled, the rusty hinges screeching in protest. The trapdoor rose slowly, revealing a dark, square hole descending into even deeper blackness. From below, a faint, dry smell of old incense and something indefinably sterile wafted up. They had seconds. The creature's whispers were now audible through the splintered wood. Come back, little eyes. Come home. We're going down, Rourke said, pushing Mendez and the girl toward the hole. It's our only shot. We move, or we become its next victims. Rourke and Mendez didn't hesitate. Mendez lowered the unconscious girl first, easing her small body into the dark cavity. Rourke followed, holding his flashlight in his teeth, his arms shaking from the exertion. As Rourke descended, he felt a sharp, sickening realization. The space below wasn't a standard crawl space. It was a narrow, finished passage, like a sealed-off hallway, leading away from the house's main foundation. The moment Rourke's feet touched the stone floor, the iron pipe holding the basement door shut failed with a loud, tearing crack. Thud! The creature slammed into the basement, its whisper now a triumphant hiss echoing above them. Rourke didn't wait. He scrambled out of the hole. The trapdoor. Cover it. Mendez was already pushing the heavy iron door back down. It sealed with a dull clang, but there was no lock. The sound of heavy scraping immediately started on the iron lid above them. It knows we're here. It'll pry it open, Mendez cried, pushing against the lid. Rourke looked around the narrow, stone passage. His flashlight beam revealed that this was not a natural tunnel. The walls were mortared stone, and the ceiling was low, forcing them to crouch. The air was dry and cool, smelling faintly of ancient earth and the persistent, sterile scent Rourke had detected earlier. Mendez, look, Rourke whispered, pointing to the passage wall. Inscribed deeply into the stone was a series of symbols, geometric shapes Rourke didn't recognize, intermingled with the familiar, terrible motif of the child's stick figure drawings. Every few feet, there was a crude charcoal drawing of an eye, always unblinking, always staring forward. A tunnel, a hidden passage, Mendez stated, her voice tight. A house this old. It makes sense. More than a house, Mendez. This is a fortress. And this isn't leading to freedom, it's leading deeper inside. Rourke pointed his light down the tunnel. We have one way to go. Move. They started forward, Rourke leading, Mendez carrying the girl and scanning the rear, both moving in a perpetual crouch. The stone passage twisted and turned, disorienting them immediately. After a minute of walking, the scraping stopped. The silence returned, heavy and complete. Did we lose it? Mendez whispered. No, it's waiting. It wants us to think we're safe. Rourke's voice was grim. Or it knows this place better than we do. The tunnel opened abruptly into a small, circular chamber. The walls were lined with shelving, holding hundreds of jars. Rourke cautiously approached one, shining his light through the glass. He stumbled back, gagging. The jars contained a clear, yellowing fluid. And floating in the fluid were preserved human eyes. Hundreds of them. Different sizes, different colors, but all staring outward with an unblinking, glassy quality. The eyes, Mendez choked out. The last piece, it collects them. Rourke fought down the rising gorge in his throat. It's a storage room. A pantry. This thing isn't just killing people, it's preserving parts of them. He backed away from the sickening collection, turning toward the center of the chamber. There were 3 passages leading out, each identical to the one they had just used. "A labyrinth," Rourke muttered. "Which way?" Mendez, still clutching the girl, pointed to the ground near the center of the room. The blood trail. A faint, thin line of the dark, viscous blood they had seen on the second floor was visible on the stone floor. It came in from the tunnel they had used, circled the chamber, and entered the passage directly opposite their entry point. "It came through here," Rourke said. "It knows the tunnels. It wants us to follow. Or it's a trap," Mendez countered. Rourke looked at the unconscious girl in Mendez's arms, then back at the collection of preserved eyes. "We don't have a choice. The tunnel leads somewhere else, maybe out. We follow the trail." They entered the second tunnel. It was longer, steeper, and the air began to warm slightly. After a few tense minutes, they heard a new sound, a faint, high-pitched whirring that seemed to come from the stone itself. The tunnel opened into a much larger, vast cavern. This chamber was clearly unnatural, excavated deep beneath the house, and it was alive with activity. In the center of the cavern was a massive, humming machine, a grotesque assembly of iron gears, copper wiring, and steam valves. It was running, its components turning slowly, and the whirring noise was deafening. It looked like a century-old industrial press, but its purpose was entirely obscure. But it was what was around the machine that seized Rourke with terror. Hanging on the walls of the cavern, suspended by thick leather straps, were several human figures. They were dried out, mummified, yet instantly recognizable as police officers by the shreds of blue uniform and utility belts still clinging to their frames. They were old, perhaps decades old, and all of them were missing their eyes, the empty sockets staring into the darkness. "They were looking for the same thing," Mendez whispered, horrified. "The officers before us. They came here and were consumed." Rourke's lights swept across the cavern, revealing the true horror of the machine. The iron structure was crusted with the gray-white bone dust he had seen on the second floor. A thick, dark sludge dripped from the gears into a large, ceramic collection vat below. The entire apparatus was a factory for the ritual. "This is its forge," Rourke said, his voice raw. "It processes them. It turns them into the material for its ritual." Suddenly, the whirring of the machine stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. From the tunnel they had just exited, a low, dry cough echoed. "Found you, little lambs." The shadowy figure of the entity flowed out of the passage, blocking their only retreat. Rourke and Mendez were trapped in the consumption chamber, between the creature and the gears of the horrific machine. The shadow creature glided into the center of the cavern, its form seeming to swell in the oppressive atmosphere of the sub-basement. Its presence was a physical force, pressing down on Rourke and Mendez, driving the fear deep into their lungs. "The cycle completes here, in the cold earth," the creature whispered, the sound vibrating in Rourke's chest. "Your arrival was anticipated. The vessel is ready." The vessel was the unconscious girl in Mendez's arms. The entity was clearly focused on her. "Stay back," Rourke roared, grabbing a rusty, heavy wrench from a nearby workbench. He knew the wrench was useless against the thing, but he needed to feel something solid in his hands. The creature ignored him, its dark, void-like eyes fixing on the girl. It flowed toward Mendez. "Mendez, throw her," Rourke yelled. Mendez, understanding the impossible command, hurled the girl's limp body toward Rourke. He caught her awkwardly, cushioning her fall, and immediately retreated behind one of the massive iron pillars that supported the furnace. The creature's momentum carried it to the spot where Mendez had been standing. Instead of pursuing them, the entity lashed out at the wall of hanging, desiccated police officers. A long, sharp claw of shadow ripped through the leather straps, sending the mummified bodies crashing to the stone floor in a cloud of ancient dust. "It's trying to cut off our escape," Mendez realized, her voice laced with panic. She scrambled away from the creature and ran toward the far side of the cavern, pulling Rourke and the girl with her. They reached the end of the chamber, where the cavern wall was crudely carved out of the earth. Rourke shone his light across the dirt wall. There was no exit, only a small, sealed opening near the floor, covered by a heavy iron grate. There, maybe a ventilation shaft. Rourke pointed. We can't fit the girl through that. Mendez shouted, her eyes darting back to the creature, which was now slowly turning, its attention returning to them. Rourke dropped to his knees, ignoring the pain in his joints, and jammed the rusty wrench into the grate. He heaved, the metal grating and screeching against the stone. The grate was bolted in place. It's bolted. The creature began its dry, chittering laughter, a sound of supreme confidence. Fleeing into the earth? A futile effort, detective. The house owns the soil. As the entity began to move toward them, its form flowing faster now, Rourke noticed something beneath the girl's neck as he held her. It was a necklace, a thin silver chain that had been pressed into her skin. At the end of the chain was the locket he had seen on the second floor table, the same tarnished, black locket surrounded by the dried roses. Rourke suddenly remembered the girl's transformed voice in the attic. The key is not for the lock. The key is for the cage. He glanced at the creature. It had paused, perhaps sensing the shift in his attention. The locket, Rourke muttered. The key to the cage. He fumbled with the chain, tearing the black locket from the girl's neck. It felt cold, heavy, and radiated a faint, electrical hum. Mendez, do you have a knife? Mendez immediately produced a small, tactical folding knife from her utility belt. Rourke took it, his hand shaking. He inserted the blade into the tiny seam of the tarnished locket and pried it open. Inside, there was no picture. There was only a thin, curled-up sliver of paper, stained black and brittle with age. Rourke quickly unfurled it. The paper contained only 2 words, written in a child's shaky, cursive hand. 412, exit. But underneath the words, the paper was folded over another object. A tiny, antique silver skeleton key, impossibly small. A key, Rourke whispered, looking wildly around the chamber. The key for the exit. Where's the lock? The creature was almost upon them now, its shadowy arms raising high, preparing to strike. It matters not, detective. The consumption is at hand. Rourke acted on pure desperation. He looked at the creature, then at the only source of immense heat in the room, the massive, iron furnace machine. He ignored the key. He grabbed the locket, the knife, the piece of paper, and the unconscious girl. Mendez, the machine. Distracted, Rourke rushed toward the furnace, scrambling onto the structure. He found a small, glowing aperture, a feed chute that looked like the door to a boiler, pulsating with a terrible, contained heat. Mendez, understanding his mad intent, drew her sidearm again and fired a single shot at the creature's mass, a useless attempt that nonetheless drew its attention for a crucial second. Rourke hurled the locket, the paper, and the small silver key into the glowing mouth of the furnace. A sound unlike any other filled the cavern. Not a shriek, but a low, subterranean roar of profound agony, tearing itself from the very foundation of the house. The creature froze instantly, its shadowy form convulsing. Its massive figure began to ripple and shrink, pulling back from the heat of the furnace. No, the binding. You break the binding. The creature screamed, the voice now thin and pathetic. The furnace, which had been silent, roared back to life, its gears churning violently, the whirring noise returning tenfold. The ground beneath Rourke's feet cracked. The machine was overloading, reacting to the destruction of the locket, the key that must have been integral to the ritual that sustained the entity and powered the house. Mendez, the Great. Now, Rourke screamed over the sound of the collapsing house. Mendez, galvanized by the creature's momentary collapse, rushed back to the grate Rourke had been trying to open. She looked at the grate, then at the furnace, then back at the creature, which was now reduced to a tormented, shrinking shadow. The small key. Did you throw the small key? Yes. What? It's a literal key, Tommy. Not a binding. Mendez yelled. She spotted a tiny, almost invisible keyhole on the grate's surface, next to the heavy bolts. The small silver key Rourke had thrown must have been the key to the grate. Rourke watched as the creature, now nothing more than a dense column of dark smoke, lunged one last time toward the unconscious girl. Mine! Rourke shoved the girl off the furnace structure and rolled off himself, landing heavily on the stone floor, just as the entire furnace exploded in a blinding flash of light and a deafening wave of noise. The light instantly banished the shadow. The creature, caught in the blinding blast, was gone, evaporated into nothing. The noise was followed by the sounds of the house foundation above them buckling and tearing itself apart. The grate. Now or never, Rourke yelled, pushing himself to his feet. Mendez gave one final, desperate tug on the grate. The bolts were rusted, but the locking mechanism must have failed in the blast. The grate came loose. She immediately began pulling the dirt and rock away from the shaft behind it. Go, go. Rourke pushed her toward the hole. The explosion of the furnace had fractured the cavern, sending fissures spiderwebbing across the ceiling. Dust and debris rained down, accompanied by the ominous sound of groaning wood and shifting stone from the floors above. The house was coming down. Mendez, get in, Rourke yelled, pushing the unconscious girl toward the newly opened ventilation shaft. Mendez, her ears ringing from the blast, shoved the girl into the narrow opening headfirst and wriggled in immediately after her. Tommy, hurry. Rourke took one last look around the collapsing cavern, at the shattered remains of the mummified officers, the destroyed furnace, and the spot where the entity had vanished. He felt a cold dread. Had he truly destroyed it, or merely forced it to retreat? He squeezed into the shaft. The hole was tight, rough with sharp stones and dirt. He had to push himself along using his elbows and knees, the sound of the structural collapse intensifying behind him. The shaft was a downward slope, meaning they were burrowing further into the earth, but away from the unstable structure of 412 Blackwood Lane. Mendez, can you see an end? Rourke gasped, the air thick with concrete dust and the sterile smell of the sub-basement. I can feel fresh air. Mendez's voice came back, muffled and desperate. It's opening up. I think it leads to a storm drain. A sudden, violent tremor shook the tunnel. Rourke looked back. The cavern behind him was completely collapsing, the large boulders and beams falling into the sub-basement floor. He pushed harder, ignoring the scrapes and cuts on his uniform and skin. He reached Mendez, who was already pulling the girl's small body through a circular opening at the end of the shaft. The opening led into a large, concrete pipe, a storm sewer. Cold, fresh air and the smell of wet earth rushed in. Mendez pulled the girl out onto the slick, moss-covered concrete floor of the storm drain. Rourke followed, tumbling out of the shaft just as the entrance to the house's sub-basement sealed itself with a final, massive crash of rock and debris. They lay panting in the storm drain, the silence a stark contrast to the cacophony of the house. The drain was dark, illuminated only by their struggling flashlights, and the cold water running over the concrete floor felt like a blessing. We're out, Mendez whispered, coughing on the dust. Rourke struggled to his knees, checking the girl. She was still out, but her breathing was deep and regular. He gently ran his hand over her head, checking for injuries. We need to get to the street and call this in. We need an ambulance for her and a battalion for that house. They began the arduous crawl through the storm drain, following the sound of rushing water, which promised an exit. After what felt like an eternity, the concrete pipe opened up into a wider culvert, with enough height for them to stand upright. Mendez spotted a grated manhole cover above them. There, that's our way out. They climbed the rusty ladder, Rourke heaving the girl up first, then following Mendez. Rourke shouldered the heavy manhole cover and pushed it aside, revealing the world above. The rain had stopped, and the early morning sky was just beginning to lighten with a sickly gray dawn. They emerged onto a deserted, heavily wooded stretch of road, miles from 412 Blackwood Lane. Rourke immediately pulled out his radio. Dispatch. This is Rourke, 742 Delta. Code 4. Code 4. Requesting immediate backup, fire battalion, and emergency medical services. Location is... He checked a nearby faded street sign. Route 38, approximately a quarter-mile from the Blackwood Lane intersection. 742 Delta. Your signal is weak. Repeat location and nature of emergency. The dispatcher's voice crackled back, sounding distant. For 12, Blackwood Lane is experiencing a catastrophic structural collapse. We have one victim, a female child, severe shock and exposure. Requesting immediate evacuation and quarantine on the location. Rourke shouted into the radio. As he finished the transmission, he looked back down the wooded embankment they had just climbed. The manhole cover was lying askew. Mendez was already kneeling next to the girl, wrapping her in Rourke's jacket. "She's waking up, Tommy." The little girl's eyes fluttered open. They were still wide, dark, and filled with a lingering terror, but the vacant, unnatural stillness was gone. "Where am I?" she whispered. "You're safe now, sweetheart. We got you out," Rourke said, kneeling beside her. "What's your name?" The girl looked up at Rourke, her expression shifting to one of profound sadness. I don't remember." Mendez produced a small bottle of water from her belt and offered it to the girl, who drank greedily. "Do you remember the house?" Rourke pressed gently. "The dark place." The girl shivered violently. "The house, it wants my eyes. The man, he kept asking me to look at the windows." Rourke exchanged a haunted look with Mendez. As the first distant wail of sirens cut through the morning air, Rourke noticed a glint of metal in the dirt near the manhole cover. He picked it up. It was the small, silver skeleton key he had thrown into the furnace. It had been ejected through the ventilation shaft and landed beside them. The key to the cage had found its way out. But as he turned the small key over in his palm, he saw that the key's teeth were stained with a thin, metallic residue, the same dark, viscous blood from the house. And as he looked back at the girl, he saw her reach up and touch her neck, exactly where the locket had been. A faint, almost invisible red mark lingered on her skin. Rourke's blood ran cold. The binding was broken. The house was destroyed. But the key had escaped, and the girl had been touched by the ritual. The arrival of the emergency services was swift and overwhelming. Paramedics immediately took the girl, wrapping her in blankets and stabilizing her before rushing her to the nearest major hospital. Rourke and Mendez were treated for shock and minor injuries, mostly severe bruising and cuts from the struggle in the tunnels. They were subjected to immediate, intensive questioning by their superiors, Captain Davis and two stern-faced internal affairs officers. The story of a towering, shadowy entity, a sub-basement machine that processed human remains, and a sacrificial ritual was met with professional skepticism, masked by forced concern. "Detective Rourke, Officer Mendez," Captain Davis said, leaning over a table in a cramped, temporary command center set up in a nearby community hall. "The fire battalion reports 412 Blackwood Lane is a total loss. The structure essentially imploded from the basement up. Preliminary reports suggest a massive boiler explosion, consistent with what you described with the furnace." Rourke pointed to the area on a map where they emerged. "The girl, Captain, she was found miles away through an old storm drain system, and the foundation was filled with mummified bodies in uniform." The IA officers exchanged a look. "We found several old skeletal remains in the rubble, Rourke. They are extremely degraded, but the story of uniformed officers will need concrete evidence." "I saw them," Mendez interjected, her voice firm. "They were hanging in the cavern. They were wearing our colors." "And the entity? The shadowy figure you shot at 7 times with no effect?" one IA officer pressed. Rourke simply placed the small, silver skeleton key on the table. It was still stained with the dark, metallic residue. This was the binding, the thing that held the house, and the thing that kept the entity focused. It was destroyed in the blast. "A key," Captain Davis sighed, picking it up with a gloved hand. "Rourke, Mendez, you've been cleared of any misuse of force. The explosion explains your missing rounds. But for the official report, we are classifying this as an extreme arson case involving ritualistic abuse of a minor, triggered by a faulty century-old furnace system." Rourke stared at him. "Sir, if we write that, it will come back. That thing isn't gone. It retreated." "Your file is being closed, Rourke," Davis said, his voice flat. "Take a mandatory week of leave. We'll handle the paperwork. And I suggest, for your career, You put 412 Blackwood Lane out of your mind. Rourke knew the score. They were being silenced, their careers preserved by a lie. The department couldn't afford the official story. It was too insane, too damaging. They were heroes who had saved a victim, and now they were nuisances who had uncovered too much truth. A week later, Rourke was sitting in his sparsely furnished apartment, staring at the file. It was the official report on the Albright case. The girl's name was still unknown, but the department had assigned her the family name of the old house. She was recovering in protective custody, unable to recall her name or anything before the house. Mendez knocked and let herself in, carrying 2 cups of steaming coffee. She looked tired, haunted, but determined. "They're calling her Jane Doe Albright," Mendez said, handing Rourke his cup. The forensic teams found fragments of the old Albright family records in the ruins. They think the current Jane Doe is somehow related to the original little girl who lived there 80 years ago, the one in the photo. "The cycle," Rourke murmured, sipping the scalding coffee. "The entity wasn't consuming random people, Mendez. It was using the house and the ritual to trap and recycle victims from a specific lineage." Mendez nodded, pulling a chair opposite him. "I did some digging during my leave. On a private server. The Albright family had a reputation. Disappearances. Madness. The original little girl, Mary Albright, vanished in 1947. Official report, runaway. Mary Albright," Rourke repeated. "She was the one in the photo, holding the rag doll." Mendez produced a heavily pixelated printout. It was a police blotter from 1947. "Look at the description." They found a note in the original police file, written by the father, a week after Mary disappeared. Rourke read the grainy text. "I fear she is still here. I hear the scratching, and the windows are watching us. I tried to destroy the binding, the black locket, but it only made the shadow angry. It took Mary's eyes. It will take mine next." The father tried to break the cycle 80 years ago, Rourke realized. The entity must have forced the girl, our Jane Doe, to wear the locket to complete the binding. "Which means," Mendez said, her eyes wide, "that for all those years, the entity was in the house, waiting, feeding, and somehow the little girl in the attic was Mary Albright." Rourke felt a cold wave of certainty. The entity was not tied to time the way humans were. It was feeding on the past and present simultaneously. "But we stopped it, Mendez. The house is gone. The locket is destroyed." Mendez placed a finger on the police report from a week ago, the official one. "Read the last line of the fire battalion's report. They found a small, personal item of value, untouched, among the rubble." Rourke scanned the text. "Recovered a single item of apparent sentimental value. A fully intact, threadbare ragdoll, found near the boiler room foundation." The ragdoll, the one hanging over the ritual circle. "It wasn't destroyed," Rourke breathed. "It wasn't part of the consumption. It's the focus, the seed. And the ragdoll is now listed as evidence," Mendez added, looking him dead in the eye. "Sealed in the department's evidence locker, along with the key you found." Rourke picked up his own phone, the screen showing the current date, Tuesday. "Where is the Albright girl being held?" "St. Jude's Children's Hospital. 3rd floor, ICU lockdown ward. We can't get near her." Rourke stood up. "We have to get to her, Mendez. If the entity retreated, it's not gone. It's tied to the ragdoll, and now it knows the key. We finished the first cycle, but we didn't end the story." He looked out the window at the cityscape, the normal, bustling world oblivious to the horror deep beneath their streets. Rourke had put on his clothes and his badge every morning for years, ready to fight men and women, criminals and psychopaths. Now he was fighting something ancient, something that wore the clothes of a little girl. "We need a plan, Mendez. We're going to break into our own evidence locker, and we're going to finish what we started." Rourke and Mendez knew the risks were astronomical. Breaking into the precinct's main evidence storage was career suicide, even if their motives were righteous. But the thought of the ragdoll, the focus of the entity, the only thing that had survived the furnace explosion, sitting in a drawer, waiting, outweighed any fear of internal affairs. They met again that night, not in a diner or an alley, but in the sterile, brightly lit environment of the police motor pool. the last place anyone would suspect them of conspiring. The vault is triple secured, Mendez whispered, leaning against the side of a patrol cruiser, her voice low and tense. Code access, biometric scan, and a single-armed guard on rotation. We know the codes and the system specs, Rourke countered, tapping a schematic of the precinct on his phone. We helped design the security for this sector. The biometric is the problem. It requires a handprint and retinal scan from a high-ranking officer, Captain Davis, or maybe Detective Sergeant Bell. Mendez produced a small, silver-plated object wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it, revealing the small, tarnished silver key Rourke had recovered. "The key is our insurance," she said. I looked up the metallurgy. It's incredibly old silver zinc alloy. If it's tied to the entity, it might react near its final binding, the doll. Rourke shook his head. "We can't rely on magic. We need a physical opening. Davis is too tightly scheduled. Bell is easier. He always hits the gym on his late shift, and he hates getting sweat on the retina scanner." They devised a plan that relied on their intimate knowledge of precinct routine. The diversion. Rourke would trigger a minor, non-critical alarm on the fourth-floor supply closet, forcing the single security guard to ascend. The access. While the guard was occupied, Mendez would intercept Detective Sergeant Bell in the stairwell, claiming an urgent message from his wife. She would then need a viable print and retina scan. The retrieval. Rourke would use the scan to enter the vault, locate the ragdoll, and get out before the guard returned or the alarm was properly resolved. At 2:30 a.m., the dead hour returned. Rourke slipped silently into the precinct's fourth floor. He bypassed the camera in the supply closet and shorted the wiring on a motion sensor. The soft, repeating beep-beep of a triggered, non-critical zone alarm echoed faintly through the silent halls. Below, the security guard, a young officer named Miller, sighed audibly over the intercom and started his ascent. Mendez was waiting on the second-floor stairwell landing. She saw Sergeant Bell descending, towel around his neck, heading for the gym. "Sergeant Bell? Hold up," Mendez called out, putting on a show of breathless urgency. "Urgent call. Your wife?" She called the front desk. "She's heading to St. Jude's. She said it's the Albright girls' ward." She sounded frantic. Bell froze, concern overriding his annoyance. "St. Jude's? Why is she going there? We're not supposed to be near that kid." "I don't know, sir. She just said the eyes are open," Mendez fabricated, playing on the tension surrounding the case. "My keys are in my office." Bell snapped, spinning around. "I need to get down there." "The security door on the main elevator is locked, sir. You'll need to use the stairwell biometric to reset the lock," Mendez said, guiding him toward the control panel near the stairwell door. Bell slammed his hand onto the scanner. Scan failed, fingerprint smudged. "Damn it, I told them to clean this thing." Bell cursed, wiping his hand on his sweatpants. He pressed his face to the retinal scanner. Scan failed, retinal read obstructed. "My eyes are probably dilated from the gym lights," Bell grumbled. He rubbed his eyes, and in that fleeting moment, Mendez was ready. She had secreted a small, specialized camera lens, no bigger than a contact lens, in the palm of her hand. As Bell turned his face slightly away, Mendez, feigning exasperation, pressed her hand near the scanner, activating the lens which took a perfect, high-resolution shot of Bell's open eye and a secondary image of his palm. "Try again, sir. Maybe if you hold still," Mendez suggested, already backing away. Bell tried one more time. Access granted. The stairwell door clicked open. Bell rushed down. Mendez, heart hammering, sprinted back to the motor pool. She wirelessly transmitted the high-res images to a tiny, handheld scanner device Rourke was holding. Rourke was already at the evidence vault door. The zone alarm was still softly beeping upstairs, and the guard, Miller, was out of sight. He inserted the handheld scanner into the main access panel. It projected the stored images, Bell's palm print and retinal pattern, onto the biometric pads. Scanning. Match confirmed. Access granted. The heavy steel door hissed open, revealing the meticulously organized vault. Rourke slipped inside, using the lowest possible setting on his flashlight. The vault was cold, smelling of stale paper and mothballs. Rourke navigated the numbered aisles, quickly finding the shelf designated for high-profile, pending cases. He found the Albright case drawer. He pulled it open. Inside, resting on a bed of archival tissue, was the rag doll. It was exactly as Mendez had described, threadbare, stained, and unervingly intact. Its button eyes, which had stared at the ritual circle in the attic, seemed flat and lifeless in the dim light. Rourke reached for it, his hand trembling slightly. Just as his fingers brushed the coarse fabric, the ragdoll's head slowly, unnaturally, began to turn. It rotated 180 degrees, the button eyes now facing Rourke. Then, the button eyes widened, stretching the threadbare cloth around them. The dry, leaf-skittering whisper filled the small space of the drawer, but Rourke knew it was only in his mind. "You returned for me, detective. The consumption begins again, with you." The moment the ragdoll's head turned, Rourke felt a paralyzing surge of fear, not his own, but a wave of raw, ancient terror that washed over him from the doll itself. The unblinking button eyes seemed to grow brighter, reflecting the light of his flashlight with an intense, malignant gleam. "The cage is broken, but the lock is yours," the whisper intensified in his mind, laced with sickening triumph. Rourke reacted instinctively. He didn't grab the doll. He slammed the evidence drawer shut, the sound echoing loudly in the cold vault. The shock seemed to break the ragdoll's hold. Rourke stumbled back, breathing heavily, his mind reeling from the psychic assault. The entity hadn't been destroyed by the furnace. It had simply retreated into its core vessel, the doll. He knew he couldn't leave it here. It was too exposed, too close to the world. He pulled the drawer open again, this time seizing the ragdoll quickly and wrapping it tightly in the archival tissue, suppressing the wave of nausea and fear that the touch brought. He tucked the bundle inside his jacket, against his chest. Beep, beep, beep. The non-critical zone alarm he had set on the 4th floor suddenly changed pitch. It was now a rapid, high-pitched WOWOWO, a critical, sustained alert. Rourke checked his watch. 3 minutes. Officer Miller, the security guard, was efficient. He must have resolved the minor alarm and was now starting his rotation back toward the vault. Rourke ran to the exit, his blood pounding in his ears. He slammed the heavy vault door shut and triggered the automatic lock, then sprinted down the hallway. He reached the stairwell, just as Officer Miller's hurried footsteps echoed from the floor above. Rourke pressed the stairwell door access, his fake biometric scan device still working. Access granted. He slipped onto the landing and raced down. He reached the main floor and burst through the lobby. Mendez was waiting near the front doors, disguised in a cleaning crew jacket. "We have to go? Now," Rourke hissed, pushing her toward the exit. "What happened?" "I heard the critical alarm," Mendez demanded, seeing the frantic look in his eyes. "It's the doll. It's alive. We need to leave the precinct now." They bolted through the front doors and rushed to Rourke's unmarked car. Just as Rourke fumbled with his key in the ignition, the squad car radio mounted on the dash crackled to life. It was Captain Davis, his voice cold and severe. "All units, be advised. Officer Miller reports the evidence vault was compromised. Detective Rourke and Officer Mendez, you are ordered to report to Captain Davis's office immediately. You are under investigation for unauthorized access to sensitive material." "They got us," Rourke muttered, slamming the car into drive. "They were waiting for us to make a move. They didn't know why we moved, Tommy. They just know what we took," Mendez insisted, twisting to look back at the precinct. As they sped away from the precinct, Rourke felt a sudden, sharp cold penetrate the fabric of his jacket, right where the ragdoll was resting against his chest. The doll was reacting to their flight. "The girl," Rourke said, driving fast through the dark streets. "We need to get to St. Jude's. If the entity's focus is on the doll, its power is probably tied to its proximity to the girl, Mary Albright. Why the hospital? Why not destroy the doll immediately?" Mendez asked. "Because we tried to destroy the binding key and it just released the spirit. If we burn the doll, the thing might jump into the next available vessel," Rourke explained, his voice strained. "The little girl. She's the perfect target, weak, traumatized, and already tainted by the ritual." They arrived at St. Jude's, a sprawling, modern hospital, about 10 minutes later. Rourke parked in an adjacent, dark lot. Jane Doe Albright is on the 3rd floor, secured ward, Mendez confirmed. We can't walk in there in uniform. We're fugitives. Rourke opened the trunk and pulled out a go bag he had prepared. 2 dark hoodies, gloves, and a few lengths of rope. We use the service stairs. We blend in. They slipped into the hospital's rear entrance, moving through the labyrinthine maintenance tunnels and service elevators. They reached the 3rd floor, moving silently through the empty midnight corridors. They located the ICU lockdown ward, a small, highly secure unit. A single uniformed officer sat behind a glass desk, reading. Officer Daniels, Mendez whispered, recognizing the guard. He's lazy. Always takes his break at 3:15. They waited. At 3:16 a.m., Daniels yawned, stretched, and disappeared around a corner toward the break room. Rourke and Mendez slipped through the unlocked door and into the ward. The ward was dark, smelling of antiseptic and sickness. Rourke checked the room numbers until he found the one marked J, DOE. He opened the door slowly. The room was small, lit only by the faint light from the monitoring machines. The Albright girl lay on the bed, her small body swallowed by the sheets. She was breathing shallowly, her eyes closed. Rourke pulled the tightly wrapped ragdoll from his jacket. The cold radiating from it was intense. We need to get her out of here, Rourke whispered. Mendez, prepare the transport. As Mendez moved toward the window, the girl's eyes snapped open. They were no longer the soft, terrified eyes Rourke remembered. They were wide, dark, and utterly devoid of fear, fixed on the bundle in Rourke's hands. A slow, terrifying smile spread across the girl's face, the same unnatural, stretched smile Rourke had seen in the attic. And the voice that emerged was not the dry whisper of the entity, but a child's voice, sweet and sing-song, yet dripping with malice. Hello, Detective Tommy. You brought my dolly home. The floorboards beneath Rourke's feet groaned, a sound impossible in the modern, concrete hospital room. Then, Rourke heard the sudden, terrifying sound of heavy boots pounding down the hallway outside. Stop right there. Police. Captain Davis. They had been followed. The entity's plan was complete. They were cornered, and the girl was no longer an innocent victim. The girl, or whatever was possessing her, sat up in the bed, the eerie, unnatural smile fixed on her face. Her button eyes, the eyes that weren't human, were locked on the wrapped ragdoll in Rourke's hands. It has been waiting for you, Tommy, the child voice sang. The house is gone, but the cycle must turn. Give me the doll. The door to the hospital room burst open. Captain Davis stood framed in the doorway, 2 uniformed officers behind him, all weapons drawn. Rourke, Mendez, drop your weapons and the evidence. You are under arrest. Davis bellowed. Rourke ignored him. His focus was entirely on the girl and the object clutched against his chest. He could feel the cold radiating from the ragdoll intensifying, drawing power from the girl's proximity. Captain, stand down. Rourke yelled. This is not what it looks like. This child is possessed. This doll is the center of the binding. Davis scoffed. Possessed? Rourke, you've lost it. That's a sick little girl and a piece of evidence you stole. Drop it now. The 2 uniformed officers started to move into the room. Mendez, thinking fast, moved to the side of the room and grabbed the heavy, rolling medical instrument stand, shoving it violently into the path of the officers. The stand crashed to the floor with a deafening clatter of metal and glass, buying Rourke a crucial second. The possessed girl seized the opportunity. She threw back the sheets, revealing that her body was twitching with impossible tension. She sprang from the bed with unnatural speed, not moving like a child, but like a puppet pulled by tight, inhuman strings. She launched herself toward Rourke. Mine, the child voice screamed, now laced with the dry, rasping whisper of the entity. Rourke, still unwilling to harm the child, dodged, the wrapped ragdoll momentarily slipping from his grasp. It hit the floor and rolled toward the center of the room. The entity's control over the girl seemed to peak. She didn't chase the doll. She simply extended her arm, and Rourke watched, horrified. as the ragdoll began to slide across the floor toward the girl's outstretched hand, pulled by an invisible, intense magnetic force. "She's drawing it in. She's the receiver," Mendez screamed. Captain Davis finally saw the truth, or at least the horror. He saw the child move with impossible speed, and he saw the doll rolling across the floor against gravity. His composure fractured. "What in God's name is that?" Davis whispered, his face slack with shock. Rourke moved like a shot. He didn't rush the girl. He rushed the only source of the ancient entity's power he truly understood, the silver skeleton key. He pulled the small, tarnished key from his pocket and threw it with all his strength, not at the doll, but at the girl's face. The silver key, charged with the ritualistic blood from the house, hit the girl's forehead with a sharp thwack and immediately fell to the floor, leaving a faint, smoking burn mark. The girl shrieked, a deafening, painful sound of pure agony, and the unnatural movement stopped. The ragdoll, only inches from her hand, halted instantly. Rourke seized the moment. He scooped up the ragdoll and the key, shoving them both back into his jacket pocket. The girl fell back onto the bed, limp, her eyes rolling back to reveal only white. The entity had been momentarily repelled, but not destroyed. "Captain Davis," Rourke yelled, holding the jacket pocket tightly. "The key and the doll are the conduit. We break them together. We need a place of immense, focused energy, an incinerator, a power surge." Davis, his years of skepticism shattered by the sight, looked at the lifeless child and the determined, desperate face of his detective. He nodded curtly. "The basement. The hospital incinerator is 2 floors down, near the power substation. Go. We'll cover your retreat." The command was insane, but necessary. Rourke and Mendez sprinted out of the room, leaving the stunned Captain Davis and his officers to deal with the unconscious child and the wreckage of the ward. They raced down the service stairs, the sound of the ragdoll's relentless coldness pressing into Rourke's side. They found the basement level, a terrifying maze of pipes, wiring, and heat. The air was thick with the smell of diesel and burning medical waste. They found the incinerator room, a dark, concrete bunker dominated by a massive, smoking industrial furnace. Rourke threw open the steel service door. A wave of suffocating, intense heat blasted out. Mendez the key. Mendez was already there. She held the small, silver key tightly in her gloved hand. Rourke took the ragdoll, unwrapping it from the tissue. The button eyes of the ragdoll immediately focused on Rourke, and the whisper returned, this time frantic, pleading, and terrible. "No, detective, please. I will leave the child. I will leave the house. Don't break the binding." "You're done feeding," Rourke growled, his face streaming with sweat from the heat. He grasped the ragdoll tightly in one hand and the silver key in the other. "The key is the lock, the doll is the cage," Rourke yelled, raising them both high over the searing mouth of the incinerator. "Ready, Tommy," Mendez shouted. Rourke hurled the ragdoll into the furnace. It hit the blazing inferno with a sound like a wet animal hitting asphalt, and immediately began to burn, its threadbare fabric blackening. The agonizing scream that erupted from the furnace was not a child's cry, nor a whisper. It was a massive, subterranean roar of pure, elemental pain, echoing the sound Rourke had heard in the sub-basement. Rourke felt a sickening tug in his chest, as if a part of his soul was being ripped out. He could feel the entity's dying consciousness lashing out one last time. He brought the silver key down with all his remaining strength onto the steel frame of the incinerator door, smashing it violently. The metal key snapped in two, the pieces flying into the room. The scream from the furnace cut off instantly. The massive door of the incinerator bulged and shuddered, and then, the fire inside suddenly died, leaving only a low, hissing silence. The heat was gone. The cold was gone. The metallic smell was gone. Rourke and Mendez stood in the sudden, complete silence of the basement, panting, staring at the inert incinerator. Did we do it?" Mendez whispered, her voice fragile. Rourke leaned against the cool metal of the furnace, his knees shaking. "I don't know, Mendez, but it's quiet now." He felt his pocket and pulled out the two shattered halves of the silver key. The pieces were now completely black, covered in a brittle, crystalline ash. The entity's binding was truly destroyed. The subsequent events were a whirlwind of confusion, cover-ups, and consequences. Rourke and Mendez were immediately taken into custody. Captain Davis, however, having witnessed the unnatural events on the third floor, provided cover. He filed a report stating that Detective Rourke and Officer Mendez, suffering from extreme trauma related to the Blackwood Lane incident, had experienced a psychotic break and were acting under extreme delusion. They were charged only with unauthorized entry into a restricted area and destruction of department property, the ragdoll. The child, Jane Doe Albright, awoke an hour after the incineration. She was terrified but lucid. The unnatural smile was gone. Her memory of the house was hazy, full of dark whispers and forced drawing, but she now remembered her name. It was Sarah Jenkins. She was a runaway from a nearby town, abducted 3 months ago. The entity hadn't been consuming the same family line. It had been recycling the ritual, using the house to find a new Mary Albright for every generation. Sarah's trauma made her vulnerable, a perfect vessel. The department officially classified the entire Blackwood Lane incident as a gas leak explosion concealing a horrific kidnapping and murder case. The bodies found in the sub-basement were ruled historical remains, possibly vagrants, unrelated to the officers who disappeared years ago. The truth of the shadow was buried deep beneath bureaucracy and fear. Rourke and Mendez both received suspensions. Rourke accepted his with quiet dignity. Mendez, offered a chance to transfer to a less stressful division, refused. 6 months later, Rourke and Mendez were officially reinstated, both relegated to the quietest, most forgotten division, cold cases and archival review. It was the department's way of keeping them functional, but ensuring they never again got close to anything that mattered. They were sitting in the windowless basement office, surrounded by dusty files and forgotten evidence boxes. It was 1:47 a.m. The shift was always the midnight one now. The Jenkins girl is doing well, Mendez reported, closing a laptop. Adopted by a family on the coast. No lingering psychological issues, surprisingly. The doctors say her memory of the house is fading like a bad dream. Good, Rourke said, not looking up from a faded police blotter he was examining. The cycle is broken. The house is gone. That's what matters. You really think it's gone, Tommy? Mendez asked, her voice low. Rourke reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. He still carried the 2 pieces of the blackened, shattered silver key. He didn't know why. Maybe for reassurance. Maybe for penance. The binding is broken, Rourke repeated, placing the fragments back. That thing was tied to the structure, to the ritual. We eliminated all 3. Mendez walked over to the evidence shelf and pulled down a large, unmarked cardboard box. Captain Davis personally sent this down to us. Said it needed archival review before final destruction. She opened the box. Inside was the collection of material from the Albright case. Police tape, crime scene photos of the imploded house, the charred fragments of the ragdoll, now nothing more than a handful of black ash, and a thick, yellow journal. The journal was bound in dark leather, clearly marked with the name of the original owner, Elijah Albright, 1947. Rourke's interest finally peaked. He took the journal and flipped it open. It was the father's account, written before he disappeared. The same man who had written the note about the watching windows. Rourke read the final entry, dated 3 days after his daughter Mary vanished. The shadow is angry. I broke the locket, and it recoiled. But it is not a creature of stone and wood, only a creature of hunger. I heard it whisper in the walls, before it finally let me write. It knows I cannot destroy the doll. But it told me something else, something chilling. It said that it only needed 1 piece of the ritual to survive the destruction of the house. 1 anchor. Something living, something fresh. Rourke frowned. The girl was rescued. The key was broken. What living anchor? He flipped the page, finding the final, spidery sentence written just before the journal ended. When the house collapses, the cycle ends, and the entity must attach itself to the last thing it saw. Something unblinking, that looks back. Mendez was looking at the charred ragdoll ash in the box. The doll was the last thing it saw before the furnace, so it attached to the doll, and then we destroyed the doll. It should be gone. Rourke shook his head slowly, his eyes wide with a cold, creeping horror. He wasn't looking at the journal or the doll. He was looking at the photo of the young officer Mendez, pinned to the wall next to her desk, a standard ID shot, taken just last year. Mendez, Rourke whispered, his voice dry. Think about the sub-basement. The final binding. When that furnace exploded, you were looking right at it. You were the last living thing to witness its agony. Mendez went rigid, her hand instinctively going to her eyes. And when we broke the key in the incinerator, Rourke continued, his heart sinking into a pit of despair. The explosion went quiet. It didn't scream. It attached. Mendez turned, her eyes wide, scanning the empty, quiet office. No, Tommy. No. The evidence is destroyed. We're safe. The entity needed a living anchor, Mendez. Something new, something fresh. Rourke pointed to her photo on the wall, then to the quiet, dark streets outside. It called the third-floor windows the unblinking eyes. It told me my last piece was my eyes. He looked at the small, dark void of the single, unblinking surveillance camera mounted in the corner.